All right. Well, thanks for coming back. It's great to be with you again and to have this last session with you. So here's the deal. This is day 2 of a very fast conference, as we've heard. It's also right after lunch. So all the blood starts rushing to your stomach. You start getting really tired. So it feels like the best way to start this is with a video clip and a little conversation. And I think this will start to move us even closer to the ground as we start to think about faith formation. So I want to show you a video. It's probably about 4 or 5 minutes. Comes from, again, the PBS NewsHour in the States. And there's an interview on a book. And the book that's come out is by an author. I should know her last name. Her first name is Wendy. And she's written this book called Relax, It's Just God. I'm not going to say any more to set this up, but what I want you to do as you watch this is what kind of jumps out to you here. We'll watch it. I'll give you a chance to debrief it with each other, and we'll see what's at stake for faith formation as we then jump back into our conversation with Charles Taylor. So here it is, a book that is on all your bookshelves. Relax, It's Just God.
Generously sprinkled with what many view as teachable moments, perhaps none as challenging as those surrounding faith and religion. Author, journalist, and NewsHour online parenting columnist Wendy Thomas Russell comes at this from a different angle in her new book, Relax, It's Just God. How and why to talk to your kids about religion when you're not religious. She recently talked with Jeffrey Brown and explained how the book came to be.
I was in the car and my daughter announced to me that God had made her and that God had in fact made all children and all people. And
you thought?
And I was so, she was so incredulous because she just thought, this seems like really big news. And how you don't know it, Mommy, is really beyond me. So, but it struck me. I mean, I was really caught off guard by it. And
what did you say to her?
I didn't say much at the time. I sort of stumbled through the conversation. Oh, who is God? And, I sort of stumbled through the conversation and then later went home and talked to my husband. And he said, it's not what Maxine believes, but what she does in life that matters. And it was a turning point for me, this idea that if we raise kids to be moral and ethical and kind and generous, then what they believe is secondary. And it's been a guiding force through the book.
I want to ask you about the title. For so many people, God and their religion are a basic component of who they are. It's not just God.
Right.
And yet you use that, just God, relax. It's
right.
Just God.
Right.
What do you mean?
I don't mean to be flippant or insensitive in any way, but it does seem like there are certain topics that are hard for parents to talk about and to broach with their children. And increasingly, religion is becoming one of them. And in a lot of secular families, the word God is almost replacing sex as a kind of this taboo subject. So
the hard discussion that parents might have.
Yes. What I was getting at was that if it's not such a difficult subject if you approach it in the right way. And so we can all sort of lighten up.
You're coming at this as a secular, non-religious parent.
Correct.
You see a growing need for this kind of discussion.
Religion isn't going anywhere. Religion is going to be around for a very long time. But it's true that secularism is on the rise, and it's growing rapidly, and it's grown in the last 20 years. The problem with a lot of parents in this particular group is that they are trying to raise their kids in this era of transition or this era of change. So let's come up with a way that we can talk to our kids about religion that's completely honest, that values critical thinking, that values religious tolerance and literacy, and that kind of leaves the door for kids to really make up their own minds.
Give me an example of a common dilemma that parents find when it comes to raising their children vis-a-vis religion.
There are quite a few, and I did a survey of 1,000 non-religious parents to find out exactly that. And the top reason cited was people weren't sure how to talk about religion without indoctrinating their kids into what they believed themselves. That was a hard line. The other one was interacting with religious family members and keeping the peace in families. When you're raising a child who is in a secular household, how do you bridge the gap between the older generations who may be more rigidly religious?
This word indoctrinating is an important one because it comes up time and again here. What's the difference between indoctrinating and guiding children, right?
Indoctrination I see as almost the antithesis of critical thinking. Of course, it's fine to guide your children, but I see indoctrination as sort of this middle ground between, full-on brainwashing and guidance. It's stronger than just merely guidance. I see indoctrination as telling children that there's only one way to believe, and that all other ways and people who believe all other things are less worthy of our respect, less intelligent, less moral. That's the crucial issue, because I think that when you do that, you set up your child to be bigoted against those who don't believe the way that you do. It's not a black and white world.
Well, so give me the example of the most basic question of your child says, "Mommy, does God exist? And what is God, or who is God?"
The way that I go about it is to say, that's a great question, and I'm glad you're thinking about it. That there are a lot of different ways that people describe God and describe what God is, and this is what some people believe, and this is what other people believe, and I don't believe in God, but that's okay. It's all okay, and you get to make up your own mind about what to believe.
Isn't that kind of mushy? Isn't it the job of a parent to I'll use the word guide again, their child to say, well, no, it's not just this, it could be this, it could be that, whatever you think, whatever goes.
Right. Well, I think within reason. And I see a difference between guiding your child to be a moral person, an ethical person, a self-respecting person, a critical thinker. Those are all really important things. Guiding them to believe in a certain way, in a certain God or a certain prophet, that is not so important. I really want to focus on what people do in life and not what they believe, because if we can judge people on their actions and not what we think the reasons behind their actions are, it makes for a more tolerant world and a better world.
All right. The book is Relax, It's Just God. Wendy Thomas Russell, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right, so this is the zeitgeist we're trying to do faith formation in. So turn to some people next to you, some people who look worth talking to. That should be everybody. And debrief a little bit what you see here. What jumps out to you? Again, this is my common joke, but if you are a severe introvert, this is where you pretend you have to call home and you need to go step outside. But just take about 3-4 minutes. What jumps out from this clip? Okay, all right. So you now seem awake. So what are your reactions? Here's a mom, probably a good mom. She's probably a way better parent than I am. She's probably doing a great job. But what do you hear her saying? We have a mic right there. I can pass you this mic. What jumped out from that clip? Here we have someone coming.
My first thought was, what an incredibly naive anthropology she has.
An incredibly what?
Naive anthropology.
Yeah, naive anthropology.
Like the idea that you can separate beliefs from actions.
Yeah.
Like, where would you ever get that idea from?
Yeah.
Everybody's belief forms their action.
Yeah. It's interesting because she goes back to this a couple times. And again, we're going to use her just as an example here that maybe highlights what it's like to be doing ministry in a secular age. Again, she's a great parent. I think her ideas are not illogical, but they are interesting culturally. And one of these ideas is that you can actually separate belief and actions. She says it multiple times. We don't really care what our daughter believes. What we care about is what she does. Now, again, to go back to that secular zero perspective, there's no way you would ever imagine those things could be disconnected. And it's a very weird world we live in that we think that you could separate belief and action, that you could act in a morally significant way, or you could be a good person, but it doesn't really matter what you believe. So yeah, naive anthropology, or at least an interesting cultural phenomenon that seems to be pretty present across big segments of the West, that belief doesn't matter, but action matters, as if belief and action aren't connected. And I think part of the story Charles Taylor's telling us is how that imagination that you could separate belief and action could occur, and how you could even get a world where people can seek to what he calls exclusive human flourishing, where you could actually flourish without any sense that there's any God or any law or any prophet, as she even references, that directs the way we should believe to impact the way we act. It's just an interesting Western phenomenon. But if you're doing Vacation Bible School or children's programming this summer and folks stumble into your congregation, parents, this is kind of what they think. And honestly, it's in our bones too. We kind of think like this as well. Yeah, jump in.
What stood out for me was just the idea that she did not seem to have a good concept of right and wrong. Everything was just relative.
Yeah.
Except for the things that she thought. She had this understanding of morality that she referenced.
Yeah.
But the other systems, they were all the same. And so it's like, there is no right and wrong, but there is, and she seemed really inconsistent. I wasn't...
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. And again, we're going to be very Charles Taylor-like, which is one of the beautiful things about Charles Taylor is he will never insult anyone for what they believe. In other words, he thinks that people have good reasons for believing and functioning like they do. So I think you're right about that. It's hard for how is she actually making moral sense. At another level, it's working for her. I mean, at the level where she feels like she's a good parent and things, I guess, are working out until they're not working out, but for the most part they are. But there is slippage on what is tolerance and what's not tolerance, and how do you negotiate those things. The highest good for our daughter is that she's a tolerant person, and we want her to have some kind of religious literacy, but how we make sense of that, she's not really sure. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting space she's trying to negotiate. Yeah.
I think a bit of the myth, though, is that she doesn't think she's transmitting something to her child when she is.
Right. Yeah.
And I sort of, where I've seen this in pastoral ministry is when I stepped into pastoring and some of, I'd say, the boomer generation, they experienced their experience of religion was very oppressive in the mind and their experiences, and I will not take that away. But so then with their kids, it's a blank slate.
Right.
There's a neutral force in this world.
Yeah.
And then they can make a decision as they become adults. And then when I have my own kids, it's sort of like, well, they're a blank slate or they're a canvas. I would like to leave some impression on that canvas and the community that I'm a part of.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, there is a certain kind of sense where she doesn't really believe this, but she kind of believes this, where she could create a vacuum for her daughter that she wouldn't impact her or form her in any way. Which she doesn't really believe that. She knows she's forming her daughter and giving her practices, but at least when it comes to believing in anything bigger than herself, she wants to create a kind of vacuum where her daughter could decide for herself. And as I continue this story, you're going to see there is a kind of high moral good for her, and that's that her daughter can be the most authentic self she can be. So if she imposes a kind of religious perspective on her, it feels like she violates her daughter's chance to be an authentic self. But it also has this sense where can you do that? Can you really do that? I mean, Jeffrey Brown, the interviewer, doesn't actually believe it's possible. You know, she keeps saying, well, you just need to be open, and he just isn't quite buying it. Well, as a parent, don't you have to guide? I mean, don't you make an impression on your children one way or another? And aren't you forming them in a certain, maybe put it in quote marks, kind of faith by not forming them at all? I mean, isn't that making some kind of statement here? And she's not sure if she wants that or not. But I think you're right. It comes out of a historical trajectory where people did feel dogmatically, and I say that negatively, dogmatically thrust upon, and not a lot of freedom within that. And so they give space, but sometimes that space itself can become a disequilibrium. The memoirist Julian Barnes has this great line where he says, I no longer believe in God, but boy, do I miss God, which is a very kind of late modern malaise. I don't think I could believe in God, but boy, do I miss God. Yeah, maybe one last comment, and we'll continue to keep Wendy in our minds as we continue this story. Any other thoughts that you want to jump in on?
I didn't like your definition
Yeah.
of indoctrination.
Yes, yes. Yeah, she in indoctrination, yeah, she has this sense of someone who stands over and against and imposes things on people. So, I mean, that is a big question, though, as we wrestle with faith formation. What is faith formation? Is it indoctrination? Is it not? Where's the line? Is indoctrination all bad, or is it good? I mean, how do we impact each other's lives? It's a big question, and at the very least shows us across the West in certain ways, people are very nervous about indoctrination. And it is labeled as a very negative thing. But you're right, it's also a very slippery definition she has. So let's pick up where we ended yesterday. Remember when I said it was going to feel like The Lord of the Rings? And you were all like, it did exactly. I love that movie, and his presentation was just like it. That's what you thought when you went to bed. But we ended here with this diagram. And just to give you like last time on, TV shows start that way, last time on. So we said secular zero, which is a little bit of a divide, or at least a negotiating between sacred and profane. And we said this is a world before there was a secular. It's hard to imagine. But then we said secular one was this sense of a divide between the public and private. So religion particularly gets pushed into the private realm. It's something you privately do. And remember we said we had this shift to now what really matters is your own will. Will you consent to this? It just becomes a big question for the kind of religious institutions we have today of will people hold on to that? And then we said that you get this kind of fork in the road where we can go to a secular two, which we said is kind of a divide between the religious and a-religious. And when I say religious, I want you to think of kind of the classic institutions of organized religion. So religion or a form of spirituality will always pop up other places. But it seems that there becomes a kind of conflict between, or a negotiation between, will you spend your time and your money, say again, at your child's minor league hockey career, or will you invest in going to church every Sunday, or will you be part of a faith community? So secular 2, we said the definition is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. And then we said secular 3, the definition of secular 3 is that all beliefs become either contested or fragilized. That belief itself becomes fragilized. Now, just to give you another kind of sense of trying to make these make sense, and then we're going to hone in down on secular 3, think of it this way, and I find this a very interesting phenomenon, because if you look across the West, I have to be very honest standing up here as an American, that America is different than the rest of the Western countries. I mean, very different in many ways. But you could make an assertion, I think Taylor helps us with this, and he has a chapter in a book called Conflicts and Dilemmas where he talks about the American exception and how religion has held on in America where it hasn't as much in some of the other Western countries. And one of the ways to think about that, just to help you kind of parse out the difference of these, is you could say that America is the most secular of all the Western countries. You could say that, and it would be true, but it would only be true if you define secular finally and fully as secular one. The American culture is the most secular of countries in the sense of the divide between the public institutions and the private religious life. The Constitution makes it absolutely clear. The law makes it absolutely clear. If you ever did youth ministry in the United States, you can barely ever utter a religious word on campus or you will be thrown off it. In a certain sense, America is the most secular of the Western countries, but only in a secular one perspective. What that meant, however, is because it was the most secular one, like think of this compared to England, where secular one doesn't really have a clean line like it does in America. The Queen of England is the head of the church. Or the Scandinavian countries, where some of the sense of the ancient regime still holds on, and how the religious institutions somewhat are connected to the public institutions in some way. But because America is the most secular one country, it is the least secular two country. Does that make sense? It becomes the least secular too. So this is why, and you all will look at Americans strangely, every American president, I don't know, since Roosevelt, maybe before that, has had to give some kind of speech about how much they love the church and love the Bible. and have to say, God bless America all the time. And good old Donald Trump, which I will not mention him again, said during the 2016 election, his favorite book was the Bible. And we're sure he's never read the Bible. But he needed to say that because the kind of grassroots folk sense of American culture is that church still matters to people. And so because it was the most secular one, it created a space, particularly within people's private lives, for religion to still have a significance. So think England, the least maybe of the secular one context, so it therefore becomes the most secular too, if that makes sense. So I just want you to see how these things kind of function. Now, Bonhoeffer wrote a very interesting article the second time he was in America. So he's in America in 30-31, and then he comes back in 39, and he actually comes back with the help of Reinhold Niebuhr and will escape the war, will not have to be in the war, therefore he will live on. But it doesn't happen, of course, and within 6 weeks he returns to Germany and then within years is killed. And most of the time he's in New York City, he's spending his time at Union Theological Seminary in a room, it's a guest room called the Prophet's Chamber, which is interesting, and he's praying and chain smoking, regretting that he's ever left Germany and that he should go back. Well, the only thing that he creates at that time, the only thing he adds to his corpus of writing is he writes a very interesting article about America. And he calls America the land, he says America is a land of Protestantism without Reformation. It is a land of Protestantism without Reformation. And what he means by that is to be Protestants in one way or another is to function out of some sense of crisis, that there's a crisis. That there's a crisis at stake here. Usually that crisis, back to the early Reformation, is that we are sinners and we need God's justifying work to save us. But there's always something within the Protestant imagination of something of a crisis going on. But what Bonhoeffer means, I think, when he says that America is a land of Protestantism without Reformation, is because it is the most secular one, least secular two. The crisis that exists often in American church life is a crisis of secular two. It is not a theological crisis. It's a crisis that fewer and fewer people are going to church. We better innovate. We better find a new way. We need fewer and fewer people are going, and if we don't do more, fewer and fewer people will go. And ironically, more people go to church in America than anywhere else, but the crisis is if we don't do something new, fewer people will go. Now, where that's really interesting for our conversation as we go into secular 3 is what's almost lost within the American conversation particularly is the sense that the crisis is how do even sinful people encounter the living God? Which was the question of the early Reformation. How is it that we encounter this living God? But the question instead becomes, what will happen to the church? How do we remake it? What do we do with it? And we particularly think of that as an institutional structure. So I think he points us to, when we go forward and we think about faith formation, these become big questions of how do we help people encounter the living God? Almost every faith formation program that you'll see out there, particularly that comes from my country and seems to go across the globe, almost is always mobilized by a secular 2 imagination. Young people don't want to come to church. How can we get them to come to church? What do we have to do to keep young adults in the church? Not the bigger question that Taylor is pushing us to, which is how inside of secular 3 do we help people imagine in a world that's in some sense moved beyond transcendence? How do we help them encounter the presence of a living God? So this moves us deeper into secular 3, and this is what Taylor says about secular 3. He says, and about us living in a modern age, he says, we can't help looking over our shoulders from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. And remember, this works both ways for him. It works that if you are a believer, you doubt. If you are not a believer, you sometimes find yourself believing. And even Lily Allen, I didn't share this part of the lyric with you yesterday, but even in that song, I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. It's how I'm programmed to function. I'm not a saint. I'm not a sinner, but everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. Inside that imminent frame, even she finds herself doubting. And those are the verses, and this is the chorus, where she says, I don't know what's right or what's real anymore. I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. When do you think it all becomes clear? Because I'm being overtaken by the fear. So even in the verses of irreverence comes the chorus of what Taylor calls cross pressure. And this doubt, this mutual doubt and fragilization, he says that everyone finds themselves crossed up at a time. So you are sure there is no God, and that anyone who spends any time in organized religion is wasting their life. And then, like we said yesterday, bam, you get crossed up, and you hold your niece for the first time. Or you go to that Bach concert at Christmas, and you find yourself overtaken by something it feels like calling out for you. You get crossed up. Or if you're a believer, you find yourself crossed up too. And you wonder, is this true? Or was this just a family I was raised in? So this sense of cross pressure. And one of the things we have to think about inside of faith formation is I just don't think there's any way inside of late modernity to do a kind of faith formation that tries to protect people from cross pressure. That we actually have to lean into it. We have to lean deeply into the cross pressure, the doubt, and seek for God inside those very moments of doubt and the need for looking for God. Now, one of the reasons I think that we're in a secular 3 age and we need to continue to lean into a secular 3 age is because of the way identity is constructed in late modernity. And this brings us to these two realities that I think are important for us, where I talked about disenchantment and things like that, is that we would look at now in this secular 3 age that we find ourselves with a new ethic and a new authority. So we inside a secular 3 age, and why I think this is more important for us to wrestle with, is because we find ourselves with a new ethic and a new authority. And we kind of referenced this when we were talking about Wendy here as we watched the video, but we're now all living with this new ethic. And this is the ethic that I referenced just a few minutes ago that Taylor would call the ethic of authenticity. And so here is how this ethic works, and you'll know this, you'll feel this in your bones. The ethic that goes across our culture now says this. It says, no other human being should tell another human being what it means for them to be human. That is actually an ethical violation for another human being to tell a human being how they should live their life. That what is most important is that you live your own unique, authentic life. That this becomes the high good. And if it doesn't work for you to be unique and authentic, you should find a unique way to be. So this becomes, I think, a driving reality in our time, that you are to go and find your most authentic self. And this is good. Taylor would ultimately say this is a good thing. It is good that we live in a culture where we honor people's experience now and we let them speak for themselves. However, it also comes with a number of excesses where how do we make sense of everyone's different way of thinking about authenticity? Now, you need some comedy in your life, I think. So let me show you a video clip that maybe shows the excesses of this ethic of authenticity. This comes from Saturday Night Live. I hope you're not deeply offended by this. I find this very funny. So this is a spoof commercial on a new kind of Levi jeans. But look at this ethic of authenticity, the drive for authenticity, that no human being should tell another human being how to live their lives. Here is the new Levi's jeans. All right, so you see in a very kind of spoofed, overblown way, the ethic of authenticity there, that the drive is really to be your own unique self. And that also then couples with this sense of a new authority. And the new authority, of course, if we're going to live in a new age of authenticity, the new authority is that you should really only follow what speaks to you. If it doesn't speak to you, it shouldn't have authority. So this becomes the new authority that we live with in a secular 3 age. So there's a story that a quite well-known New Testament professor tells. It's a very interesting story. And he says that he was out on the road one time, and he had met this guy. And this guy was probably in his, late 20s, and he happened to be a weightlifter. And he was just ripped. That's all he did was lift weights. And he meets him, and they're talking. This guy's a New Testament professor, so they start talking about church and God and things like that. And the weightlifter guy says, I just love Jesus. I'm just so into Jesus. Jesus is the most important thing in my life. And the New Testament professor is pretty taken by this. And the guy's pretty convincing. He's like, wow, that is really interesting. He's like, yeah, man, Jesus is the most important thing in my life. And I just love Jesus. And, and the New Testament professor, he's clearly into Jesus, and he lifts as many weights as Jesus. Like this guy is really into this. And so they're talking for a while, and they're going deeper in their conversation. And the New Testament professor says, I study the New Testament stuff, but I also study early Christian martyrs. And, I'm just wondering, you're talking so passionately about your faith. I wonder, do you think you would die for Jesus? Do you actually think that you would die for him? And the guy thought about it, and he didn't kind of flippantly answer. He really reflected and thought about it, and he finally said, yeah, you know what? Yeah, I think I would. I think I would die for Jesus. And again, the New Testament professor was taken aback, and he believed him. He said, that's amazing, man. You must have went through an incredible faith formation program. I mean, to get to this level of on fire for Jesus, I mean, where do you go to church? Where do you worship on Sundays? And the weightlifter guy changes his disposition, and he says, oh, well, I don't go to church on Sundays. He says, what do you mean you don't go to church on Sundays? Yeah, I don't go to church on Sundays. He says, wait, why? He says, well, I don't because it's, I just find it boring. It's just completely boring. So the New Testament professor is telling a group of pastors this story and says, so I said to the guy, I turned to him and I said, so let me get this straight. You'd be willing to die for Jesus, but not be bored for Jesus? And then all the room of pastors start clapping, and like, hell yeah, give it to him. Yes. It's a great story, but I also think the New Testament professor misses the point. See, inside a secular 3 age, it seems superficial, but it may be deeper than that. The New Testament professor doesn't see the moral elements of this as it's connected to authenticity. That if you are bored, it is potentially, or it runs the risk of being in a violation to your own identity, and particularly how you're constructing your own identity and how you're making your own unique self. So you could read that story, or you could kind of interpret that story in 2 ways. You could interpret that story as a secular 2 story. Oh, see, we need to get our churches more exciting. Or we're missing young adults like this. Or see, it's just a generation of superficial kids who just will not come and do more contemplative exercises. Or you could read the story inside a secular 3 story, which is to say, as he tries to make meaning and find purpose in his life, that which doesn't speak to him has no authority, and he's done with it. Very different ways of interpreting these realities. So when we get back to this diagram here, or one of the other ways to think about this, and we'll see, we can talk about this more because it's an interesting conversation, but another way that Taylor tells this story is he makes these moves through these 2 triads, where he talks about the ancient regime, the age of mobilization, and the age of authenticity. So we are in the age of authenticity. So you can think before the Industrial Revolution, before the Enlightenment, we were in the ancient regime, the land of kings and queens. Then we enter into what's the age of mobilization. And you can think this is easiest to think about within the American revolutionary documents and even the American Constitution, where it says, we the people. We the people organize and mobilize our own ways of life. But Taylor's point is we now live in an age of authenticity, where the highest good is you find your authentic self. Now I tell you that because if you look at the bottom 3 triads here, you can think of these, and Taylor uses these in what he calls his Durkheims. And if you don't know Durkheim, don't worry about it. But Emil Durkheim is one of the founding fathers of sociology. And Durkheim was very interested in how religion leads to certain societal functions. And the way Taylor uses this is to talk about what he calls Paleo-Durkheimian, Neo-Durkheimian, and Post-Durkheimian. The best way to think about this is just the Neo-Durkheimian is the days of kings and queens. The Neo-Durkheimian, when I hear Neo, I just think the Matrix. But just go with me. He means something like the denominational Christianity. But then he says we enter a time potentially where we enter into what he calls a post-Durkheimian age, where we don't do religious forms in kind of the institutional structured way we did. Now, I bring this up not to confuse you more, but to show you that we have a potential issue we have to deal with. And you particularly see this in American mainline Christianity, which American mainline Christianity is as committed as any form of Christianity I know. And when I say mainline Christianity, I'm thinking Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians, United Methodists, that they're more committed than anyone to the ethic of authenticity. You do you. You find you. But the problem is, if they are so deeply committed to the age of authenticity, to keep their denominational structures going, You actually need to have some kind of neo-Durkheimianism. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is it's off kilter. So the more you hear people talk about how these denominations want to allow people the freedom to express themselves, the freedom to be whoever they want to be, it's a good thing. We should all celebrate that. But they also need people to commit to certain forms of denominational Christianity, which demands actually that you mobilize your life in a certain way, that you're loyal to that group, that you're committed to that group. And those things don't work very well. So in America, you have mainline Christianity that's doubling down on the age of authenticity, but needs a neo-Durkheimianism. And ironically, evangelicalism is more willing to do post-Durkheimian forms of church, whether it's a mega church or house churches or churches all online or something, but they tend to, ironically, be more committed to the age of mobilization. We need to protect Christian America or something like that. And one of the reasons religion is so weird in America is both of those groups are completely off kilter. And I don't actually know, to be completely honest with you, what it would look like to get those in line, but it is a fundamental issue. And we've seen it as more and more progressive communities, which in many ways I'm all for, have continued to try to help young adults find their unique way to be themselves. Most of our mainline churches, anyone who's under, say, 40, are actually people who have migrated from conservative Protestantism. Mainline communities have not done a good job of actually passing the faith on to their own children. Their own children decide, why do I need church at all? Well, maybe this isn't true at all. So when we think about faith formation inside of an age of authenticity, this becomes a big question for us. So we go back to this diagram, and the thing I didn't give you is these two things kind of in, I won't call them opposition, but in a dialectical relationship. And in a secular three context, the dialectical relationship you have here is the difference between takes and spins. And this does get us into thinking about how we do faith formation in a secular three age. So Taylor said the context that you will do faith formation in is the immanent frame. You are in the immanent frame. There is no way for you to live outside the immanent frame. It is the kind of cultural lens that we're given. However, you do have choices on how you'll live inside the immanent frame. And you can either, he says, take what he calls a closed spin. You can spin the immanent frame closed, or you can have what he calls an open take. And what he means is that even inside an immanent frame, there can be experiences of transcendence. There can still be experiences of a living God who speaks to us. It will be very different than anyone 500 years ago, but there are ways that you can still have those experiences. Or you can spin it closed and say, well, anyone who has those thoughts is crazy. That can't happen. Now, what's really fascinating, and maybe will work for you, maybe won't, is he says he can tell you if you're an open take person or a closed spin person by him telling you a story. I mean, this has been a theme of this conference, how stories play in. And he says, I'll tell you a story, and your reaction to the story will tell me if you are an open take or a closed spin person. And for him, that story is the story of St. Francis. I mean, he's a good Catholic. So he says, let me tell you the story of St. Francis. If I tell you the story of St. Francis, a young man who's got privilege, who's got money, and he gives it all up, takes a vow of poverty because he's heard the living God speak to him, and takes on poverty and lives the rest of his life in poverty. He says, hopefully you'll hear the story better than I just told it. But he says, if I tell you that story and you think to yourself, oh my gosh, people are so stupid. I mean, look what religion does to people. I mean, it's how dumb can people be? See, primitive people think dumb, primitive things. He says that's a close spin. He says if I tell you the story of St. Francis and all of a sudden you feel like, whoa, I don't know what that means. I don't know if I believe it or not, but man, it makes me wonder, is there something out there beckoning to me, calling out to me? What could this possibly be? That this is more what he calls an open take. Now, Taylor, as a good Catholic, would tell you to look at St. Francis. What I would tell you as someone who's been raised by TV is to watch the movie Jeff Who Lives at Home. Has anyone seen the movie Jeff Who Lives at Home? All right, here is my official review of Jeff Who Lives at Home. It's not a great movie. It's really not a great movie. But it's a really good one for illustrating this to you. And very rarely, come on, you got to give me credit, very rarely will you see someone even put up a slide of a movie and then tell you the official review of it is it's not that good. So go with me here. But it's worth watching, but it's kind of 3 stars. But no one has seen this movie? Okay, well, you guys are sophisticated people who do better things with your life. But you should watch it now with Charles Taylor in your mind. Because if you've seen this movie, no one has, what happens here is you have 2 characters. You have Jesse Siegel on the left, who's Jeff, and then you have Ed Helms, who plays Pat, his brother. And what's occurred is their father has died in the last couple years or something. And Jeff is the classic young adult who has failed to launch. He is living in his parents' basement. He's living just in his mother's basement. His father's just died. He's living in his mother's basement. He's not doing really anything with his life. But Jeff has this deep sense that there must be some reason his father's died. There must be some story to his life. So Pat is basically living for one thing and one thing only. He's going to get a Porsche. He works, he sells stereo equipment, and he's going to drive a Porsche. He's married. He brings a Porsche home at the beginning of the movie. He tells his wife, I did it. I did our dream, that I got a Porsche, and she is mad. She throws his pancakes for breakfast on his Porsche and leaves. Well, Jeff is having a different experience. Jeff's at home, and the phone rings, and on the other line, he picks up the phone, and someone says, hey, is Kevin there? And he says, no, man, you have the wrong number. Kevin's not here. He says, come on, man, don't lie to me. Is Kevin there? He says, there's no Kevin here. You have the wrong number. Don't lie to me. Get Kevin on the phone. So no, man, really, there's no Kevin here. Man, I know Kevin is there. Get him on the phone. No, Kevin isn't here. Click. Well, what Jeff does after that experience is he thinks to himself, Kevin, what does this mean? What does it mean that just this happened? Well, the phone rings again. He picks it up, but this time it's his mother. And she's like, Jeff, get your butt out of the basement, go to the hardware store, and buy some glue to fix a shutter. So he goes, and he's walking to the bus stop, and all of a sudden he sees a young man with a basketball jersey on. And on the back of the basketball jersey, it says, Kevin. So he follows Kevin, thinking there's some reason for this. So he follows Kevin, and Kevin ends up at a basketball court, and they start playing basketball together, and they start, hanging out. Then they smoke some cigarettes together, and they're together, and it looks like maybe there's something here. And then Kevin ends up beating him up and stealing his money. Well, while that happened, of course, he's out in town now, and he sees Pat. So clearly the Kevin thing didn't work, but he sees Pat, and so he goes and finds Pat. Well, Pat has gotten a lead that his wife might be having an affair. So they decided in this kind of espionage way to see if that's true, and they follow her. Well, they chase her around town. It becomes kind of a weird buddy movie. But they end up at a graveyard, and it happens just to be the graveyard that their father's buried in. And in this moment of being in the graveyard, Pat, the closed spin guy, has a moment of openness. And they're by their dad's grave, and he says, I keep having this dream. It's a weird dream. Keep having this dream, and in the dream, Dad tells me this thing. And he says what his dad tells him. And Jeff's sitting there listening to it, and Jeff goes, Pat, I have that same dream. I have that same dream. There has to be some reason for this. There's something bigger here. I have that same dream. And as soon as he says that, Pat, then the clothes spinner, just spins it closed and goes, oh, well, so this must be a weird psychological thing. Dad must have just told us that sometime. And then Jeff gets frustrated, but no, Pat, don't you see there's something more? No, he spins it closed. Well, the movie unfolds, and it gets better and worse. This is my official review. I'm spending a lot of time on a movie that's not that good, but it's making a point. And the movie ends where Pat actually helps reconcile his brother and his wife. Beautiful moment. It's a very Hollywood moment. Happens on a traffic jam on a bridge. His brother gets out of the cab and runs to reconcile with his wife. Then it goes back to the inside the cab, and Jeff says to the cabbie, do you ever think you'd find your purpose in life? And you just think, well, there's got to be more. And the cabbie has no idea what he's talking about. It's like, what? And so that's it. And then all of a sudden we see a shot of the water, and we realize why there's a traffic jam on the bridge. There's a car submerged in the water going down. The next thing we see is Jeff out of the car, racing, running on the bridge. The next thing we see is him jumping into the water. He goes into the water. He goes under the water. He pulls out 2 young girls, probably 11 and 13, pulls them out of the car. And they say, our daddy's under there, our daddy's under there. So we see Jeff grab a breath and go back down. He goes under, and all of a sudden the dad pops up. And then it becomes an uncomfortable 10 seconds where Jeff doesn't come up in the water. And if this was a French movie, the credits would roll. And Jeff would be dead. But this is not a French movie, this is a Hollywood movie. So then Jeff pops up. The final scene of the movie is Jeff at home, back in his mom's basement, and the news comes on. And it says, terrible accident happened on the blah, blah, blah bridge. And these 2 girls were saved by an unidentified man. And it's the 2 girls. And they say, we just don't know what would have happened if we would have lost our daddy. Our whole world would have been broken if we would have lost our daddy, which is part of Jeff's own narrative, losing his dad. And then, of course, the next news clip is the father. The father who is, of course, the banner comes up. He is, District Superintendent Kevin Ryder. And it is this sense of an open take. And what Taylor's saying is inside a secular age, you have a choice. You can spin things closed. Yeah, there's weird stuff that happens, but we're just weird people who make meaning out of stuff that isn't there. Or you can wonder, is there something calling out to me? Is there something bigger? And I think one of the ways we do faith formation inside a secular 3 age is, do we invite people, young people and old people, into an open take? What if? What is the story here? Is there something more? And what Taylor will say, which I think is very helpful for people like us, is that another way to think of the closed spin open take is, particularly inside religious communities, is you can either be a dweller or a seeker. You can be a dweller or a seeker. And he's taking this from the sociologist Robert Withnow. But you can either be someone who dwells or someone who's on a pilgrimage journeying. And he just doesn't think inside of a secular 3 age we have much of a choice other than to be seekers, to be people who are on a pilgrimage to try to figure out what's going on here. And that's a very different disposition of how we think about doing faith formation. I think so often, at least particularly within youth ministry, but not just youth ministry, we've thought about faith formation, captivated or captured by a secular 2 mindset, is that we are dwellers trying to make more dwellers. And by dwellers, he means people who are committed to the institution. And he just doesn't think that's possible now. I mean, maybe it is in some context, but ultimately we have to be seekers. We have to be people who believe again. And he takes this title from a Roger London book called Believing Again, and he thinks that that's the way we go forward, that we have to become the kind of people who believe again. It becomes a very different way of thinking about faith formation, of how we journey with people as they seek for God up against their big stories, up against their big questions, up against their doubts. But this then leads us into a more direct theological conversation, which one of the things we almost never talk about in faith formation, or a lot of the faith formation programs that I know, is almost never is faith defined. Have you ever noticed that? That we talk a lot about trying to pass on faith to another generation of people, and there's a lot of really good practical stuff out there, some of it done by good friends of mine. What's fascinating is they'll give you all sorts of practices to think about faith, all sorts of things to do, but they almost never define what faith actually is. And so when you don't define what faith is, and then you enter into conversations about decline, and you particularly use sociological measures to show us decline, you almost always give the definitions of faith over to the sociologists. And I'm not against that. I like sociologists. Some of my best friends are sociologists. Sociologists are great people. And sociologists do have to reduce faith down so that they can measure it. And so they have to reduce it down usually to some kind of form of consented belief, or they have to reduce it down to some kind of level of participation, because that's what they need to be able to measure it. But I don't think from a biblical theological point we want to see faith as just participation or consented belief. So let's think about actually what faith is. And this takes us into the biblical story a little bit. And I've told you one of my favorite gospel texts is the Mark 9 text. One of my favorite epistles is 2 Corinthians. And I love 2 Corinthians because at least my kind of paraphrase of it is it's just a fascinating story of pastoral identity. So you have to understand what's going on in Corinth, and there's people more qualified in this room to tell you about it than me. But I like to think of Corinth, to think of it in kind of context of American cities. Like, it's not Washington, D.C. It's not necessarily even New York City. What Corinth is Las Vegas. And there are cool things that happen in Corinth. And Paul was in Corinth, and he started a church. And he started it right on the Strip in Las Vegas. And it was a pretty good little church that he started. But, of course, Paul's got to go off and do his other things. And so while he's gone, a bunch of new members join his church right on the Strip of Las Vegas. And they're people in the business. You know, they're kind of important people running the Britney Spears show or whatever. Just go with me on this. And they're important people. And so they keep getting Paul's letters, and they like them. But what happens between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians is that Paul shows up back to the church. And he shows up, and people are really expecting him, especially all these new members, because they've read his letters, and they kind of like it. And they think, wow, you know, this Paul is a powerful guy. I mean, Paul, this is really interesting. Well, he shows up. And what they're expecting when Paul arrives back in Corinth is they're expecting someone like Brad Pitt. I mean, that's what they're expecting. I mean, this is what works on the Strip. They're expecting Brad Pitt's going to stumble into their congregation. But they don't get Brad Pitt, people. They get something different. They actually get Danny DeVito. And they're like, what? No. When we read these letters, we were picturing Brad Pitt. And this is Paul? This is the Paul of the letters, essentially, they say. And it gets kind of worse for Paul because not only is he nothing to look at, but then he preaches. And they're like, oh. Yeah, 3 out of 5 stars, maybe? Like, I don't know. Like, we could never build a whole show around this. There could never be dancers behind and you know, get people into gamble. This isn't gonna work. And I love 2 Corinthians because essentially, at least in my gloss of 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians is Paul's response to this. And so he writes to these new members, and he starts, you know, I told you yesterday I live in Minnesota, and Minnesota's an incredibly passive-aggressive place. And I kind of like 2 Corinthians because it's speaking my grandmother's language. It feels so passive-aggressive, you know, where Paul does the whole thing of, I could boast, but I won't boast, you know? Like, I could boast. I mean, who's been more hungry for the gospel than me? I mean, who's been beaten more than the gospel? I could tell you that, but I'm not going to tell you that. I mean, I'm not going to say this, but I'm going to, you know, I wouldn't say that. It's kind of like, Paul, you are saying it, you know, when you're not saying it. So he does the whole passive-aggressive thing, but then he gets actually to the heart of the point of the letter, as I understand it, and he actually admits it. He says, you're exactly right. You are exactly right. I am nothing to look at, and I am a little bit better than an average preacher at best. You're right. But then he gets to his theological point. But he says, don't you see, you Corinthians? That's what qualifies me to preach the gospel. Those are my very ordination credentials. Because don't you ever forget that your God comes into the world crucified and dead. That I am a foolish one, and the foolish ones are those who are qualified to proclaim this word. Because this word is foolishness that nevertheless brings life to it. We know from, of course, Paul is in the Acts 9 story, and there's a very interesting New Testament scholar that I like a great deal named Michael Gorman, who's done some interesting things with Paul. And one of the things that he explores and plays with is this idea of what really is going on with Paul as he goes through his Acts 9 experience. And you know the story, of course, Paul's headed to Damascus to really purify the boundary, to put down these group of Jews who have somehow got it in their mind that this crucified Jesus is the Messiah. And he's on his way. Of course, then Jesus shows up. He's knocked to the ground. And then we're told in Acts, this beautiful line, it's beautiful to me because it has so much pathos to it, that Saul is found on the street called Straight in Judas's house, which just feels like a novelish kind of detail. That seems interesting. And he's there in that house, and Gorman plays with this idea. He wonders if Paul is headed to Damascus with Phineas on his mind. You remember Phineas? You have to be a real Bible nerd to remember Phineas. Phineas is actually Aaron's grandson. And remember Phineas, as they move into the promised land, all of a sudden, I always say when Phineas, the first Phineas I always think of is Phineas and Ferb. Do you guys know? Do you guys have kids who watch Phineas and Ferb? But this is very much a story not for Phineas and Ferb. This kind of Phineas is not Phineas and Ferb. It's more Game of Thrones than it is Phineas and Ferb. So you remember this story that the Israelites start, having a good time with the people in the land, and they start partying with them, and it gets all Game of Thrones as Aaron goes into a tent, and there's an Israelite man and a Moabite woman getting it on, and he takes his spear and he puts it straight through the two of them. And then we are told that this act was reckoned unto him as righteous. There's only one other person who gets this distinction, reckoned unto him as righteous: Phineas, and of course the other one is Abraham. So Gorman plays with this idea that maybe Paul is headed to Damascus to be the contemporary Phineas, to purify the boundary of Israel's disobedience. And then he's knocked to the ground. And there he is now in Judas's house, and his identity has been fractured. His story has been lost. I mean, we've been talking about story a lot through this conference. And one of the other things that Taylor helps us and tells us is that he says our identities are always built in stories. No one can have an identity without a story. Actually, what an identity crisis is when you find the stories that you've been living out of no longer work. When you find that your stories no longer work, like, I thought he loved me, and then he told me he's been sleeping with his secretary. That story, finding that the story you've been living out, he's faithful to me, he loves me, is very different, will throw you into an identity crisis. So we all have our identities in and through stories. Stories aren't just functional things. They're deep, deep things that we build our identities around. And Paul has his story. Possibly it's the story of Phineas. Don't know, but we could play with the idea. But there he is laying in Judas's house on the street called Straight, blind. And his story has been lost. For all intents and purposes, he's in the middle of an identity crisis. And then, of course, the Holy Spirit comes and tells Ananias to go and see him. Which Ananias has got to be like, no. I think he actually kind of says no. Like, come on, Holy Spirit, this is a trap. I have seen The Empire Strikes Back, and this is exactly what Lando did to be able to get everyone. This is a trap. But out of incredible faithfulness, he goes, and he sits with Paul and ministers to him. I mean, in many ways, I think Ananias has not had the depth of reflection that he deserves as he goes and ministers to Paul in this moment of brokenness and loss of story and shares his place in the midst of this moment. But Gorman plays with the idea that's maybe there, or maybe in that blindness, that all of a sudden Abraham comes back to him. And if Phineas is not the narrative to live out of, maybe the other who's reckoned unto him as righteous is the one to live out of. But there's something very different between Phineas and Abraham. Abraham's faith is in a God who takes what is dead and makes it alive. A God who moves out of barren wombs. A God who shows up and arrives when things are their most impossible. When he is old and unable to have child, and his wife, her womb is as dead could be. Then God moves out of this. So in many ways for Paul, faith becomes embedded in the confession of some kind of death experience, some kind of experience of being at the cross, that this becomes a central place where faith is finding the living Christ in these very moments of loss and finding God moving within them. So it starts with the confession, actually, of the cross. So faith formation starts with a community of people who invite others to share the depth of their death experience and together seek for God to move in those moments. It is deeply confessional of our life stories. But our life stories, it's just not telling stories, it's telling stories in the very shape of cross and resurrection, of confession of impossibility and the anticipation for God to move out of them. In 1938, Bonhoeffer gave his last confirmation sermon, and I think it's really formative for us to think about as we think about faith formation. He gives this talk, and ironically, he gives it on this confirmation sermon on Mark 9. And he tells this, he's got about 10 confirmands that he's leading through, and he tells them that they should be careful, that Confirmation Sunday is an important Sunday, but they shouldn't think too highly of it. After all, we do never confess our faith out in a church service. We always do it out in the world. And then he says to them, we will confess our faith out in the world. And he says, faith is not something that can be banked. You cannot bank faith. The only kind of faith that you can have, he says, is faith that is like manna. You only can have enough faith for today. And if you try to bank faith, it will spoil. You can only have enough faith to make it through this day. Now think about how radically different that changes the way we think about faith formation. If we were just to think about younger generations of people, at least in my country, almost every youth ministry program is built on a secular II perspective, and it's built to bank faith. Think, well, if the youth program is good enough, we'll be able to bank enough faith in young people that when they go to university, they'll be able to live out of the accrued interest of that they got all through the youth ministry program. So we just need to help them bank faith. Bonhoeffer's point, which I think is quite true, is if you try to bank faith, it will spoil. The only thing you can do is give your people and give young people enough faith to get through today. But here's the thing. If you can give them the practices, the narratives, the stories of how to have enough faith to get through today, you've given them, and you've formed them in a way to have the next faith for the next day, and then the next day. But faith is always one day at a time. It's a very different way of thinking about this. How do we give them the stories and the practices to do this? So let me conclude by telling you some stories about that, just 2 or 3 stories to conclude, that maybe illustrate this movement of finding faith in the confession of this death experience and finding enough faith to make it through the day. So to give you kind of a story that's connected to pastoral practice, I had a friend who was a pastor of a Presbyterian church. And the Presbyterian church was, in the Presbyterian church you have a session, and the session is the leadership of the church. And sessions are notoriously conflicted. And usually when a church is in conflict, the session is the place where they fight it out. And he knew there was a possibility that there was going to be some blood spilled at this next session retreat he was going to have. And there was big things that they had to deal with. I mean, really big things, like should the carpet of the narthex be blue or red? Like, people die for this in churches. And so he was worried that conflict was going to rise big time. So he decided he was going to do an exercise. He had learned it at a conference like this or something, and so he decided to try it. So there were 8 people in the session, so he took 4 chairs and had them facing one way, and then took 4 other chairs and had them directly facing the other. So you would sit face to face with someone. He then put a pad of paper on one side. And as people came in, the first hour of the whole session retreat, what he asked people to do is to sit down across from someone, and the people who had the notepad on their chair, they were supposed to, in complete silence, just sketch the face of the person in front of them. They're supposed to do this. And they would do it for 6-7 minutes. He would say switch, and then you would switch and draw someone else. And so this went on 4, 5, 6 times. Now this church probably had someone in it that your church has as well, or kind of people, archetype people. And one was Jody. I think every church probably has a Jody. This Jody happened to be, late 30s. She had found her way into the church when she got transferred for her job. And she was just a ball of energy. And she just kind of kept the church going during a pastoral transition. She paid for their yearly service on the beach they did every summer. She was just full of energy. She was on every committee, and she was just upbeat. And she always had a smile on her face. I think every church has a Jody. But every church also has a Dave. And this Dave was 65, somewhere, maybe close to 70. And Dave was the kind of guy who told you why you buying a Toyota was a really stupid thing to do. He always told you why the church was better back a few decades ago. He's the kind of guy who was supposed to fix the front door and then locked everyone out of church for a while. He's the kind of guy in the last session meeting, they said they needed to really get giving up, and then was found shaking down new members for money. Like Dave was just kind of bombastic and kind of a little, little curmudgeonly, but he was willing to do stuff. And so there he was. Well, Dave and Jody are there, and the session's there. They get done with this exercise, and they're debriefing it. And my friend, the pastor, says, well, what was that like for you people? And they say, it was weird. It was a really weird thing you had us do. But, we kind of got into it, and it was good. Yeah, it was meaningful. And he could feel it. He could feel the whole vibe of the meeting had changed, and he thought, we've gotten somewhere. Except when they got to Dave. They said, well, Dave, what's this experience been like with you? And Dave just went off. And Dave said, well, I agree with everyone. I found it really meaningful when we did this, except when Jody was looking at me. And then he just goes off. I don't know what it was. I just felt like Jody was judging me. Jody was just judging me, and I felt small. I felt like she was attacking me. I didn't like it. I just hated it. And now everyone in the room doesn't know what to do. And the oxygen just is sucked out of the room, and people are trying to compute this. Like, how did bombastic Dave feel intimidated by Jody? But he just keeps going off. I don't know. She was just judging me. I just felt judged by her completely. I just can't believe how much she was judging me. And finally, my friend kind of got control of the room and said, Dave, thank you for sharing this. This is really important stuff. Thank you for being willing to share with us. But could you help us understand why you were reacting this way? I don't know. She just judges me. She's just judging me. Dave, it's a really important reaction. Thank you for sharing it. Could you help us understand? And then Dave was quiet for a while, and my friend had no idea. Like, was he going to storm out of the room? Was he going to get more angry? He had no idea what was going to happen. And then Dave was just silent. In the whole room, no one could even look at Jody. And Jody was in the corner blinking as fast as she could, trying to keep the tears from coming out. And then Dave started to talk. He said, well, I guess. And then he stopped. And he looked down at the ground. He said, no, yeah. That's it. And he said, well, I guess a lot of you, my daughter, Donna, who was about Jody's age. And I told a few of you that Donna had just moved home with us. And some of you asked, you said, oh, that's great. Is she going to come to church now? And I said, no, Donna can't come to church on Sundays because she works on Sundays. But he said, I was lying to you. Donna's never worked on Sundays. She works Saturdays in the middle of the week. But see, Donna's not working at all anymore. The reason she moved home with us is because she missed so many shifts she couldn't pay for her apartment. See, the issue is that Donna really suffers from some debilitating depression, and things have gotten really bleak. And I guess what it is when I see Jody, I think about who Donna could be if she didn't have the depression. And everything changed. He was no longer a-hole Dave. Actually, he still was a-hole Dave. But he was a person. He was a person up against a death experience. He was a person that in that moment, it became a holy moment because he confessed that he was up against the cross. And as a community, they bore his humanity and sought for the living presence of God in that very moment. It was an event. My friend did some things, some wise things he learned at a conference like this. He set up chairs, but he could never control what happened. He could invite them to tell their stories, but he could never control what happened in the midst of that story. But he could be very aware that when that story was told, God was at work, that God was moving within it, that they were sharing deeply in the sense of his humanity. In my book, Faith Formation in a Secular Age, I try to play with these ideas, which was kind of a dumb idea, but it was to play with these kind of Greek words of thinking of faith formation moving from kenosis to hypostasis to theosis. See, it makes you almost want to vomit when I repeat those Greek words. But kenosis is the sense of humility that moves to the sense of hypostasis, which is a word that the Greek Orthodox and the Orthodox tradition likes to use, but we, particularly in Protestantism, don't use as much outside of doctrinal language. But it's this sense of encounter with personhood that then leads to a sense of transformation, of being transformed with it. And in many ways, that's what happened with Dave. Dave had a kenotic moment where out of humility, the humility of the group and his own humility, he decided he would be vulnerable and share the story. And in sharing that story, there was an eventful encounter with his personhood through that story. And it changed everything. These movements. If you asked someone, I would guess, in your congregation, and you said to them, describe a time where you really felt like God was using you, like God was really active in your life. And you had a school teacher. My guess is the school teacher would not say, Well, the time I knew God was using me was when I got all the kids up to district standards or whatever, or to province standards. My guess is they wouldn't say that. Maybe they would, and if somebody did that, they should feel pride. They're doing a good job. My guess is if you asked a school teacher in your congregation, when was a time you felt like God was really using you? They would tell you a story that moved from cross to resurrection, that moved kenotic, hypostatic, theosis. They would tell you a story like this. Well, there was a girl in my class, my grade 4 class, and her parents were going through a really ugly divorce. And we knew this as teachers. Well, I took my class out for recess, and I lined them up at the end of recess to take them in. And I couldn't find her. We couldn't find her. Well, it only took me a minute or two to look, and there she was. She had lodged herself inside the slide. So I told my teaching assistant to take the class in. And as the class went in the building, I sat at the bottom of the slide. And I saw her, and we shared a look, and I said, honey, I know this is a really complicated time. And she slid down the slide, and she grabbed my hand, and we walked in to the building. And as we walked back to the class, I said to her, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. And we shared another look. You know, at the end of the day, I was sitting and I was correcting some papers, and all of a sudden I was just overwhelmed. And I knew that God had used me. That this was maybe the most important day of my whole teaching career. And what would happen in a narrative like that? That she has this moment of the kenotic moment, where it's not in her job description to care if this little girl's having a hard time. But she puts that aside and decides to share in this little girl's personhood. And she calls a thing what it is, as Luther says in the Heidelberg Disputation. This must be a really hard moment. And she has this sense that she's being taken up into something bigger, that she both is giving and receiving ministry. People who have, I think, deep moments of feeling transformed, they either have been given or receive ministry. And I think faith formation happens in the invitation for people to both receive and give ministry. And the Christian life is not just giving ministry to the world. It's also receiving ministry. It's receiving ministry from the stranger to actually receive it. You can only understand the logic of the crucified Christ by both participating in giving ministry to your neighbor, but also in receiving ministry. These become profound realities of transformation. So last story as we conclude, and I think we'll maybe have time for Q&A, or else you see I just tell you stories. But this is an important story I think illustrates all this in a good way to close. So I told you during the Q&A yesterday that I did these interviews. Remember I told you I did these interviews in the Seattle area, 2 Presbyterian church, a Lutheran church, and I asked these people, have you ever had an experience where you felt the presence of God? Well, one of those interviews, one of my last ones at a big Presbyterian church, was not going well. I was interviewing a woman named Rachel. She's probably late 30s, early 40s. She had 2 kids, elementary ages. And she came in, it was a Sunday morning, and she just had the look on her face that she did not have time or the energy to be talking to some professor from somewhere about something. But her pastor had asked her to do this, so she was willing to give 30 minutes. But the whole time, it was just not going well. I mean, she just one-word answers. This was an interview method where you just look kind of, you share a question and you just look for a conversation to happen, and she wasn't into it. So I had one question, lasts about 7 minutes, 7 minutes, and so I just decided I'd try it. And then I said, well, this is going to probably be a dud, and it's just not going to work for my research, but I have one question. So I threw it out, and I said, you know, Rachel, have you ever had an experience where you felt really ministered to? And you felt so ministered to, you just felt like the presence of God was there. And her whole disposition changed. And she said, yeah, I have. And then she said, I've never told this story. And she said, you know, I've been telling you throughout this interview that I'm a single mom, but I never told you why I'm a single mom. She said, I'm a single mom because 4 years and 8 months ago, my husband got on a plane and he flew to Chicago, from Seattle to Chicago for a business trip. She said he was gone 17 and a half hours, and I got a phone call. And on the other line, the person said, ma'am, hi, I'm calling from the Hyatt Chicago, and ma'am, Well, ma'am, I've never done anything like this, so but ma'am, well, it seems that our cleaning crew was cleaning rooms today, and well, ma'am, they got to your husband's room, ma'am, and ma'am, I don't know how to tell you this, but our cleaning crew found your husband, and man, he's deceased. Ma'am, your husband is dead. I'm calling to give you the address to the hospital morgue where we have sent his body. I'm very sorry, but here it is. She said she heard those words, they didn't even compute. And then she finally was making sense of it, and she looked around her whole house and her 2 children who were on the floor playing, one an infant, the other a toddler. And the first thought that rushed into her mind was, my life is over. The whole room, the color was sucked out of it, and it was black and white. She somehow grabbed a little business card. She wrote out the address to the hospital morgue, and she got off the phone. She called her mother to come stay with her kids. She got on, booked a flight. She decided that what made the most sense was to fly to Chicago, identify the body, make arrangements for it to be flown back to Seattle, and to get home. She didn't know anyone in Chicago. So she got on that flight, and she told me that flight lasted 20 hours. It lasted 20 minutes. She said, I was in such deep grief, I didn't even know if I was in time and space. She landed at O'Hare. Again, knew nobody. She walked down to the cab stand, and she gave the cabbie the card with the hospital morgue address on it. And he drove. She said, we got to the hospital, and she said, I should have noticed this. She said, I should have noticed this, but I was drowning in grief. I should have noticed he didn't park the car, or he parked the car. He didn't drop me off. So he parked the car, and I walked in, and she said they had my itinerary, and they knew when I was going to arrive, and as soon as I arrived, they took me immediately back. And she said I was standing there and waiting, and I knew as soon as this would happen, my life would be over. And then a man dragged in a gurney, and there it was, a body with a sheet on top of it. And he grabbed the sheet to pull it back, and she said, I knew when I would see him, my life would be over. And he started to pull back the sheet to reveal her husband's body, and she said, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and an arm came around the front with a water bottle. And she started to cry, and she said to me, it was the cabbie. It was the cabbie. She said, I never felt more ministered to. I got back on that plane, and I knew my life would never be the same, but I knew God would not abandon me. I mean, incredible story. And she told me she's never told anyone in her church, anyone, that story. But here is an incredible moment where she feels the presence of the living God who comes to her in this shared moment of persons in relationship. This cabbie who had to do a kenotic act, he should have been somewhere else. He had every right to be somewhere else. His job was to get a fare and move on. But what did he do? He goes in and shares in her death experience, sees her humanity, shares in her humanity, and to her, she feels taken up into something bigger than her. She feels healed. She feels assured that God will bring some kind of new life out of this devastating death. And I know nothing about the cabbie, not one thing. But doesn't he need some kind of community to tell that story in? Talk about open take or close spin. Doesn't he need to come in to some community and say, I got to tell you what happened to me? I don't know why I did this, but I was on my last fare of the day, and this woman came, and I could see the sadness in her eyes, and then she handed me that card. Oh, and I knew that place. I remember my cousin Leon had his heart attack, and he was taken there, and I remember my aunt in grief at that place, and I knew I couldn't leave this woman alone. So I don't know why I did it. I parked the car, and I followed her in. Next thing I knew, I was next to her. I don't know. I don't know what to make of it, but I think God used me. I just feel like God used me in a big way. And yet I don't know. Maybe he has a community where he did that. But absolutely, this is what faith formation becomes. Sharing these narratives. And then starting to tell our own stories through cross and resurrection. I think this becomes, it becomes a way of faith formation you can't control. But it also becomes a way of faith formation that takes us into the world to seek and be the kind of seekers that seek for God to move in this way, taking what is dead and making it alive. So I think the first step of faith formation is how do we help people tell these kind of stories where they confess their death experience? Not to glorify death, like we're a Norwegian metal band. Just think about that. The Christian faith doesn't glorify death, but it does believe that death is the context where the living God moves. That death is the location where God shows up, taking what is dead and making it alive. Dead wombs, impossible situations, impossibly bound and grinded down in Egypt. This God moves. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for these people. And as they prepare to leave this place, God, I pray that you would communicate to them that you are well pleased with their ministry. That you would remind them that even though it's hard, even though it's exhausting, even though ministry feels overlooked, especially in this culture, that ministry itself is an incredibly powerful, beautiful thing. Beautiful in its weakness. So ennoble them, God. Encourage them and remind them that the work they're doing is profound. Because it's the only form of human action. Ministry is the only form of human action that can actually participate in death and bring life out of it. So give us eyes to see the movements of your own life from cross to resurrection, from taking what is dead in us and making us alive. Give us eyes to see. Amen. All right, we are at time. I just want to say thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to be with you, and blessings to you.